Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. You stop fearing them after the third week. The hollow, I mean. That's what I started calling them. Zombies felt cheap, too loaded with fiction, with rules that no longer applied. These things didn't moan for brains or claw at windows with theatrical hunger. They just were, silent, blank, patient. And they followed me like I was the only fire left in a world grown cold. They don't eat me. They don't lunge. They don't even seem to see me the way they see others. At first I thought it was luck, maybe some quirk in my blood, or something I did differently. Now I think it was always inevitable. I've walked through cities turned to tombs. I've passed makeshift barricades, burned out trucks, bodies slumped in stairwells. Every once in a while I hear voices, shouts, sometimes gunfire, but I keep moving. People are unpredictable. The hollow at least have a logic I've come to understand. Before all this, I had a name, Martin Hale. I lived in Brooklyn. I calibrated machines for a water testing lab and spent too much time worrying about routine things like rent, broken subway lines, or whether my next shipment of seizure meds would be delayed again. I've had epilepsy since I was a teenager. Focal seizures, short episodes, most people wouldn't even notice. But my brain always ran hot, even on the meds. Now I wonder if that's what saved me, or cursed me. The collapse wasn't sudden. It didn't start with explosions or a wall of flame. It was quieter than that. A government-issued emergency tone first, then silence, then rumors, cities falling, hospitals turning people away, family members disappearing mid-call. But at the beginning, no one understood the scope of what was happening. Rumors spread of violent, unthinking mobs. Friends from across the country called, saying the situation wasn't limited to New York. They'd heard about clusters in Los Angeles, Dallas, even rural towns in Indiana. My phone lit up with frantic messages from family in Binghamton. No matter how many texts I sent, no one seemed to have a clue, except that we had to stay inside and hide. But that was impossible for me. My epilepsy medication needed to be refilled every 2 weeks, and I only had a few days' supply on hand. With the city locking down, I realized that if I didn't get my hands on enough medication, I'd end up in serious trouble. Seizures strike with no regard for crisis or apocalypse. In hindsight, I should have followed official instructions and holed up, but that wasn't an option. So I left my apartment, just to the local pharmacy on Flatbush Avenue, half a mile away, and promised myself I'd be back in less than an hour. If I had known what I'd see on the way, I might have hesitated longer. Stepping outside that morning, the first thing that struck me was how still the street appeared. Normally I'd hear the rumble of traffic, the honk of cabs, the chatter of folks heading to work. That day, I noticed storefronts boarded up, shutters pulled down, broken glass sparkling near an ATM as if someone had tried to smash it open. I spotted a city bus idling at an intersection with no driver inside. On its side, the words, "Emergency Evac Transit" had been painted in red, as if some official quickly commandeered it before vanishing. A thrumming noise arrived from a distance, too deep to be everyday traffic. It sounded like rotors, military helicopters maybe. I crossed Atlantic Avenue, weaving past abandoned cars and bicycles left on the sidewalk. Trash drifted along the gutters as if the wind was the only moving force in the city. I reached the pharmacy near Flatbush. The automatic doors stood wide open, sensors smashed. The interior was dark except for the emergency lights. A strange hush settled over the aisle of cold medicine and disinfectants. No cheerful voices called out from behind the counter, no beep from a cash register. As I moved deeper into the store, my phone started buzzing from constant push alerts. Some repeated the same official message. Others were from local news outlets, referencing aggressive infected individuals. One alert simply read, "Widespread contagion, city under partial lockdown. Do not approach the infected." I still believed it was some sort of plague or rabies-like virus. The word zombie never crossed my mind then. If someone had told me the dead have come back to chase the living, I would have laughed. It sounded like a movie, but that was before I saw them up close. In the dim aisles of the pharmacy, I stepped around spilled cough syrups and half-crushed cereal boxes. My plan was straightforward. Grab my epilepsy meds, get bandages, bottled water if available, then hurry back home. So I navigated by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. In the far corner, the locked glass case for prescription meds had been shattered. Bottles and boxes were everywhere. I was kneeling to find the specific brand my neurologist had prescribed when I heard something scrape behind me. It was a soft scuff on the linoleum, almost like a shoe being dragged. My phone beam swept across the darkness, catching a glimpse of a figure near the blood pressure machine. Clothing in tatters, face slack, eyes unfocused. At first, I assumed they might be a wounded customer or a frightened looter. I was about to say something like, "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" Typical, but naive. Then the figure lurched forward, arms hanging strangely. In the faint light, I realized their face was a sickly, pallid grey, with open sores along the jawline. I shifted behind a shelf, hoping they hadn't noticed me. The figure jerked its head, as if trying to sense movement. My phone vibrated again, bright screen illuminating the shelf. That glow must have attracted their attention because the figure shuffled sideways, mouth opening and closing in an unnerving rhythm. I edged away, careful not to make noise. My elbow accidentally knocked over a row of pill bottles, sending them rattling across the floor. Immediately, the figure rushed in. It didn't sprint, but moved faster than a normal walk, like someone half-dazed but determined. Instinct told me to get out of there. Some unknown reflex made me crouch behind the counter. The figure swept past me, almost brushing my shoulder. I expected them to lunge at me. That's what the news alerts had warned about, the infected attacking anyone. But they continued forward, stumbling deeper into the pharmacy, as if they were searching for something else. That was the first time I realized something was off. This infected person, or turned, as I started calling them later, didn't even register my presence. It felt like I was invisible to it, or at least uninteresting. Warily, I gathered the medication bottles I needed, stuffing them into my backpack, along with bandages, antiseptics, and a small pack of disposable masks. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The official alerts, the deserted streets, and now this turned figure ignoring me. On my way out, I slipped on a slick patch of red. Maybe it was blood. Maybe it was something else spilled on the floor. My feet lost traction and I fell sideways. In those seconds, I caught sight of a second turned figure lying near the aisle. Its mouth was partially open, teeth stained. My arm landed against its face. Something sharp pressed into my forearm, breaking the skin. I pushed away, confusion flaring. The cut wasn't deep, but a line of warmth trickled down my arm. I scrambled up, rummaging in the aisle for a bandage, and pressed it to the wound. 1,000 thoughts collided. Infection, contagion, the claims that bites turned victims into these wandering husks. Panic flickered in my mind, but I forced myself to keep moving. Outside, a battered news van sat crooked on the curb. Its side read, News 4 NY. Camera equipment lay scattered on the street. I wondered if the crew had been filming the chaos. Something told me to get away, so I did. I walked quickly, checking behind me. Oddly enough, no turn followed. Back in my apartment, I locked every bolt, slid my couch against the door, and tried to calm myself by reorganizing the items in my backpack. That was when I first noticed the blackish coloration around my bandaged wound. Faint lines that looked like veins had begun branching across my skin. A swirl of alarm and disbelief set in. I found antiseptic cream and thoroughly cleaned it again, wrapping the arm more tightly. For hours I sat in darkness, glancing at the emergency alerts flashing on my phone and the flickering overhead bulb. Outside my window, sirens rose and fell in the distance. Helicopters roared overhead sporadically, their searchlights sweeping across building rooftops. Through it all, I studied my forearm. The black lines kept spreading, but I didn't feel the throbbing or burning I might have expected from an infection. I felt normal, except for the creeping sense that something was taking hold under my skin. I swallowed a dose of my epilepsy medication, wondering if it would even matter now. Eventually, I dozed off. When I awoke, the city outside had grown eerily silent, except for an occasional echo of shouting. My wound had clotted. The black veins were more pronounced, but they no longer seemed to expand. I realized I still felt no fever, no nausea, nothing that might indicate a typical infection. Was it possible that my epilepsy, or the medication itself, had done something to block the turned pathogen? 2 days later, the entire city was in full crisis. I ventured onto my fire escape to see the blocks around me. Plumes of smoke rose from random pockets. A police cruiser was stalled near the corner, hazard lights still flashing. I spotted a few National Guard trucks rolling down Atlantic Avenue, soldiers scanning the sidewalks with tense stances. In the distance, up near Barclays Center, glass windows looked shattered, the giant screens blank. No sign of crowds, no sign of typical city life, just emptiness. I needed to test a theory, though I dreaded the risk. On the second day, I stepped outside again, if only for a short walk down the block. If the turned ignored me that first time, it might not have been a fluke. For all I knew, they might come after me the second they saw me. But something urged me to see if I was truly invisible to them. Sure enough, I encountered a small group of the turned near an alley. From a distance, I observed them. They moved aimlessly, one leaning against a parked taxi, another staggering in circles. My presence didn't register. I took a few steps closer, rummaged through a trash bin to make noise. They barely reacted, just turned their heads a fraction. Then they drifted away as if I wasn't worth their attention. It was an unnerving relief. Perhaps because of my epilepsy, my abnormal brain waves, or the medication in my system, my neural signals weren't something they recognized as prey. That was my best guess at the time. I was no medical expert on viruses or prion diseases, but it was the only explanation that fit. I decided if I stayed in my apartment indefinitely, I'd eventually run out of everything. Also, the black veins on my arm compelled me to seek real medical attention, if any existed. Rumors circulated online that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had set up a response base near Philadelphia. Others claimed there was a military safe zone at Fort Hamilton in South Brooklyn. Messages were contradictory, some obviously fake. Still, I had a potential advantage. If I could pass among the turned unharmed, maybe I could slip out of the city and find help. So I gathered supplies: a small camping backpack with energy bars, bottled water, my medication, a short crowbar for protection, and a map of the tri-state area. Then I set out on foot, heading south. Walking through Brooklyn was like traversing a ruin. Cars were abandoned, some with their doors wide open. Uncollected trash blocked stoops and alleyways. Occasionally, I saw groups of the turned drifting along sidewalks, or gathered inside a restaurant with the door broken in. The name zombie came to mind, but it felt too fictional. I started calling them the Hollow, because of their blank faces and the emptiness in their eyes. Some I dubbed the Rabid if they moved in a more frenzied way. Maybe it was a silly mental distinction, but labeling them helped me keep track. Every so often, I spotted living people hiding behind locked steel gates or standing guard on rooftops. A few times they shouted at me, warning me to keep away. I realized from a distance, I probably looked like one of the infected, with my stained clothes and a vacant stare. But I had no interest in them, and they had none in me. As I continued past an overturned city bus, I noticed something unusual. Behind me, several Hollow began to trail along. They kept a steady distance, heads tilted, as if listening to something in the air. If I picked up my pace, they matched it. If I slowed, they paused as well. The black veins in my arm tingled. It was a subtle sensation, like a faint vibration under the skin. That was the first time I suspected my presence might actually influence them. I tested it by stepping into a side alley. The hollow behind me turned as well, forming a scattered line. They didn't lunge or attack. They simply stood there, as though waiting for some unspoken direction. I felt a strange mixture of surprise and unease. They behaved like they recognized me as their own, yet simultaneously something about my scent or signals made them see me as a focal point. It was deeply unsettling, but also offered a unique advantage. If they weren't going to attack me, maybe I could manipulate their movements. Why would I want to do that? At the time, I was thinking about how to navigate the streets with less risk of drawing armed survivors' suspicion. A mass of hollow behind me would definitely look threatening, and yet I couldn't just tell them to disperse. They only responded to my presence, not commands. I had no voice in their heads, or so I thought. On the third night outside my apartment, I found shelter in an old warehouse near the Brooklyn Army Terminal. The building's main gate had been forced open, and the interior was dark except for some flickering emergency lights. I managed to climb to the second floor and barricade a small office. The shutters were intact, so I had some privacy. To my surprise, a handful of hollow lingered outside the warehouse. They drifted among the crates and dumpsters, occasionally milling near the entrance. Whenever I peeked out a window, I'd see them. If I retreated from view, they'd wander aimlessly but remain close by. At some point that night, I experienced an epileptic aura. It was like a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense that a seizure could strike if triggered further. My mind felt unusually clear, but my body twitched. I shut my eyes, bracing for the wave of confusion or the meltdown that typically came with an episode. That was when I heard a faint rustling below, a synchronized shuffle. Peering out, I watched the hollow gather at the warehouse doors in an almost structured formation. It looked like they were responding to my aura, to the fluctuations in my brain activity. That's when my suspicion solidified. I wasn't invisible to them. I was more like a beacon, recognized as different. My abnormal neural patterns, and possibly the partial infection in my bloodstream, put me in some twisted category. The black veins on my arm were a testament to that. However, this also meant they seemed to regard me as a leader figure, or at least an entity they could follow. I didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, I reached the Fort Hamilton area, hoping the rumors of a military camp might be true. The roads near the base were blocked by hastily erected fences and piles of concrete barriers. Tall floodlights illuminated a checkpoint, though the lights flickered intermittently. I assumed a National Guard unit might still be stationed there, but I saw no one. Near the fence, a group of living civilians emerged from a side street. They seemed jittery, clutching improvised weapons, metal pipes, a baseball bat, a broken broom handle. The moment they spotted me and the small cluster of hollow drifting behind me, they panicked. One of them shouted warnings, brandishing the bat. They thought I was one of the infected leading an attack. I tried to call out that I wasn't a threat, that I was human. My words caught in my throat when I saw how the hollow around me stirred, as if responding to the tension. Their steps grew less random, and they focused on the group. I raised my hands and took slow steps to the side, hoping to demonstrate I meant no harm. The survivors had none of it. One rushed forward, swinging the bat. I sidestepped, and the hollow lunged in unison, forcing the group to scatter. A few survivors managed to climb atop a nearby car. Others fled behind barricades. Only after I backed away did the hollow relent. Instead of chasing, they simply turned to follow me again. I felt no guilt for scaring those people. They struck first. In that instant, I decided it might be safer to avoid large bands of survivors altogether. If I tried to approach them peacefully, they'd see me as a threat, especially with my trailing horde. Some might say I had a responsibility to help others. I understood that sentiment, but I also had to face reality. If every attempt at goodwill got me attacked, what was the point? Still, I told myself I was not a monster. I hadn't hurt anyone, nor had I unleashed the hollow on innocent people. I just didn't see how I could help. I spent weeks navigating deserted streets, moving by night to avoid heavily armed groups who might mistake me for something else. The entire time, the Hollow rarely strayed far. Sometimes their numbers grew if I passed through areas thick with them. Other times they dwindled, some losing interest. My epilepsy symptoms became erratic. I no longer had full seizures, which should have been a relief. But occasionally, I'd get these fleeting auras that coincided with the Hollow coalescing around me in near-perfect unison. It was as if each aura broadcast a silent signal they answered. I had no idea whether this new condition was permanent or if it would worsen over time. All I knew was the black veins on my arm never faded. In fact, they spread faintly up to my shoulder, yet I was alive. And when I needed supplies, I could pass into infested territory with minimal threat from the Hollow. That advantage felt like a key to my survival. Everything changed the day I tried to save Joshua, a boy I found near the wrecked remains of a subway entrance on 86th Street. He looked around 10, wearing a dusty t-shirt and cargo shorts. He was alone, cowering against a metal railing, a small flashlight clenched in his hand. I spotted him from across the street, a cluster of the Hollow lumbering closer. They'd likely heard his voice or the clank of metal. I felt a stirring inside me, the same empathy I once held for innocent bystanders. I approached him carefully. The boy noticed the group of Hollow behind me and panicked. He tried to scramble away, but I positioned myself between him and them, motioning for him to stay put. To my relief, the Hollow halted, as if uncertain. They formed a loose semicircle around me. I gestured for the boy to move to a safer spot. He didn't trust me at first, but after glancing at the silent crowd of Hollow, he warily climbed a section of rubble to gain higher ground. The group behind me shifted their stance in a synchronized wave. For a tense moment, it looked like they might rush the boy anyway, but I managed to step forward, and they paused, as though my presence overrode their hunger for living flesh. Eventually, the boy darted into a partially collapsed subway entrance. At the bottom, behind a half-broken turnstile, I saw two adults, likely his parents, a man and a woman, battered and exhausted. They huddled around a small camping lantern, rummaging through meager supplies. When they saw me and the Hollow behind me, their expressions twisted in horror. I called out that I was human, that I wasn't there to harm them. I even asked if they needed food or water. The father's eyes flicked nervously between me and my silent entourage. The mother held the boy close, trembling in a corner. I tried to approach slowly, using calm words to explain that I was infected in a different way, that I could make the Hollow hesitate. But the father didn't want an explanation. He shouted something about me being a threat, that I must be controlling these things to lure them out. The mother grabbed an old kitchen knife. I raised my hands in a sign of peace. The Hollow behind me reacted to my shift in posture, stepping forward in unison. This only fueled the parents' fear. I glimpsed the boy, pressed tight against his mother. He looked absolutely terrified, tears streaking his face. I urged them to trust me, to let me move the Hollow away. All they had to do was stay quiet until I directed the group elsewhere. My voice came out stiff, urging them to remain calm, to wait while I cleared a path. But they didn't listen. The father lunged, swinging a metal rod. He struck me hard across the side. Pain shot up my ribs, and I stumbled backward. The mother scrambled toward me with the knife raised, her voice raw with desperation. The boy clung to her, pleading for them to stop, but the parents moved as if cornered animals. The Hollow behind me unleashed a collective groan. Several rushed forward, no longer under that delicate balance of my presence. The father tried to swing the rod again, but the wave of Hollow yanked him off his feet. The mother swung the knife in a desperate arc. Two more Hollow closed in. I stepped back, trying to call them off, but it was like a thread had snapped. My aura, my presence, whatever intangible hold I had, was overshadowed by the frenzy of violence. Realizing the situation had gone far beyond my control, I pivoted and pressed myself against the wall. The parents' own fear had triggered the exact chain of events I'd hoped to avoid. The boy's screams echoed across the dim subway corridor. The mother's voice soon joined in, shouting for someone, anyone to help. I tried to pull a few hollow away, physically grabbing their shoulders and shoving them back. One turned to face me, confusion in its unfocused eyes, as if it recognized I wasn't typical prey. By then, it was too late. The father struggled on the ground, the mother cornered against a defunct token machine. Their shouts cut through the gloom, and the boy's cries rose higher. I made a split-second decision to get the boy out of there. I grabbed his arm, intending to drag him to safety, but the parents interpreted it differently. The father, bleeding, pinned, saw me pulling his child away and reached out with a desperate glare. His words were a jumble of accusations. He thought I was taking his son hostage or something worse. A wave of hollow descended, blocking my line of sight. In the end, I only managed to pull the boy a few feet away before the father's frantic swing of the rod nearly struck the child. Stumbling backward, I lost my grip. The mother wrenched her son away from me. In that moment, she turned furious eyes on me, as if I was the cause of all of this. And maybe I was, inadvertently. She slashed wildly with her knife, too terrified to think clearly. I dodged the blade and backed away. The boy was shrieking, clinging to his parents. Their combined panic overcame any sense of reason. They would rather risk the hollow than trust me. I saw no opening to help. The crowd of hollow was surging in from all sides. The father's rod swung in every direction, inadvertently drawing more of them closer. My attempt to do good ended in chaos. Fearing for my life as well, I backed off entirely, my mind numb at the realization that there was nothing more I could do. The last sight I had of that family was them pressed to a corner, weapons flailing. The father shouted curses at me, the mother's voice lost to a rising din. I remember stumbling up the rubble, emerging onto the street, feeling a swirl of disbelief that it had escalated so quickly. My mind swam, searching for a moral anchor. I had tried to help, to shield them with my unique condition. In return, they had tried to end me, believing I was the bigger danger. The boy's wailing followed me for a block or two before fading into an echo. I reached a silent side street and sank to the ground behind a battered mailbox. A faint streetlight flickered overhead, revealing the black veins now snaking up to my bicep. I stared at them, feeling a stony emptiness replace whatever warmth I once had. The world I found myself in didn't reward compassion. Time and again, I saw how survivors attacked anything they didn't understand, and the hollow responded to fear and aggression with equal violence. I realized in that hollow silence that my illusions of being a benevolent savior were just that, illusions. The memory of the father's hostile gaze, the mother's blade, the boy's cries, all cemented a harsh truth. In this new reality, being helpful or virtuous often ends with a blade at your throat or a rod swung at your head. I pressed a hand to my side, the bruised spot where the father's rod had connected. My clothes were damp with sweat, and the slightest movement made me grimace. Slowly, I steadied myself, watching a few hollow drift into view. They paused when they sensed me, uncertain whether to gather around. I rose to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my ribs, and simply walked away. Several of them trailed behind at a respectful distance. I sensed their presence, like static at the back of my mind. It occurred to me that I could have ordered them, if I knew how. But maybe that was impossible. So far, I'd only seen them respond to my seizure auras. Over the next few days, I kept off major roads, avoiding both large mobs of hollow and armed human enclaves. I started to favor the quiet, ruined streets where nobody ventured. In the gloom of each abandoned block, I reflected on that final moment in the subway station. A child's parents would rather attack me than accept help from someone who looked like a threat. It dawned on me that maybe I couldn't blame them. In their eyes, I was the one controlling a group of the hollow. I must have appeared monstrous. They had no clue about my epilepsy or partial immunity. They only saw what they could interpret, someone who walked freely among these creatures and came near their child. Still, their betrayal, and that's how it felt. had hardened me. I told myself I was done risking my life for anyone who blindly lumped me with these mindless creatures. Was that callous? Possibly. But so was watching a family lunge at me with a metal rod and a blade when I just tried to save their kid. I continued south, skirting the edges of destroyed neighborhoods, sometimes seeing pillars of smoke or flickers of gunfire on the horizon. My phone died soon after. There was no electricity to recharge it. I heard no more official broadcasts, no more recorded pleas to stay indoors. Here and there, I caught glimpses of a militia group or local blockade, but I avoided them, slipping by in the shadows with my silent entourage. When they saw my silhouette and the figures behind me, they typically fired warning shots or hurled debris. I never engaged. Somewhere near Coney Island, I found a deserted amusement park. The iconic ride stood rusted and quiet, signs dangling precariously. I climbed to a vantage point near the boarded-up entrance. For a moment, I gazed at the deserted wonderland, Ferris wheel cabins swaying in the wind, a roller coaster track that looped into darkness. It struck me how thoroughly the world had changed in a matter of weeks. I decided to rest in a small service building within the park. The hollow drifted around outside, forming a slow-moving circle. At some point, I blacked out for a while, maybe from exhaustion or another small seizure. When I snapped awake, I noticed a group of them lingering near a broken arcade machine, as if waiting for my next move. Looking at their vacant faces, I thought back to the people I'd tried to help. That family. The mother's desperate slash of the knife, the father's rod connecting with my side, their fury, their refusal to see me as anything but a monster. The boy's silhouette burned into my memory, and what did I gain from trying to intervene? Nothing. If I had walked by without a second glance, I'd have saved myself the bruises. That's when I realized, deep down, that I shouldn't risk myself for strangers who would sooner destroy me than trust me. It was a decision that felt cold-blooded, yet it gave me clarity. Life in this new world required self-preservation above all else. My epilepsy, my partial infection, these hollow that followed me, they were all tools to keep me alive. From then on, I avoided any attempt at heroism. If I saw survivors in need, I kept my distance. I didn't taunt them or lead hollow to them, but I also offered no assistance. On one occasion, I watched from a rooftop as a small group of desperate individuals barricaded themselves in a retail store, while a horde of hollow pressed against the glass. One older woman within the group spotted me through a broken second-floor window. She waved frantically, calling for help in a voice that carried across the still air. Instead of responding, I turned away. I'd witnessed the cost of stepping in. I had no desire to repeat that fiasco. The woman's pleas echoed in the back of my mind, but I forced myself to continue across the rooftop. Perhaps that moment sealed the shift in my soul, from a person who wanted to do good to someone who would only look after himself. Occasionally, a pang of guilt would surface, the memory of the boy clinging to my arm. But I'd push it aside, reminding myself that my attempted kindness had nearly ended in my own downfall. The deeper I traveled into the outskirts of the city, the more deserted it became. I roamed neighborhoods that once buzzed with life, cafes, barbershops, hardware stores, and found them hollowed out, some doors forced off their hinges, some windows boarded from the inside yet ripped apart. Many times, I spotted hastily scrawled signs reading, "Safe inside, do not enter," or "Quarantine zone, keep out." One large intersection in Gravesend had a tall wire fence erected around a string of row houses, with tarps overhead suggesting an improvised encampment. No one stood guard, though. No voices carried from within. It was like a ghost town ringed by sheet metal and barbed wire. I didn't bother poking around. I'd already learned the danger of stumbling onto frightened survivors. Every so often, I came across battered community bulletin boards. They were layered with missing person flyers, taped or stapled in a rush. Faces peered out from crumpled pages, old folks, teenagers, entire families. The words, "Have you seen my mother?" or "Desperate for news," repeated again and again. No answers would ever come. Despite my resolve not to dwell on other people's tragedies, I found myself taking a moment to read some of them. It felt like gazing into a time capsule from only a few weeks ago. I'd usually sense movement behind me, shuffling footsteps of the hollow that continued to linger, reminding me it was time to move on. As I drifted south along the edge of Belt Parkway, I noticed the cityscape begin to thin out into wider roads. I saw vacant strip malls and car dealerships smashed open, their display windows in shards on the asphalt. Once I caught sight of a ring of armed individuals blocking off a stretch of highway near Bay Ridge. They had an overturned cargo truck for cover and had arranged barbed wire in neat rows. The silhouettes of rifles and improvised armor glinted under the grey sky. They might have been city officials or local militia, impossible to say, but I knew from experience that approaching such a group while escorted by Hollow was a death wish. I skirted around them through side roads and alleyways. The Hollow moved with me, their steps rustling debris that collected along curbs. Occasionally, I'd step into a convenience store to rummage for anything edible. The shelves were typically stripped bare, but I found the odd can of soup or a stray packet of crackers. If any Hollow strayed inside with me, they wandered aimlessly, uninterested in the goods. With each passing day, the lines on my infected arm crept a little higher, forming a network of dark streaks across my bicep. Apart from a dull ache, I felt no serious discomfort, which was both a relief and a concern. I had no idea if it was incubating something worse. Eventually, I crossed from Brooklyn into the outer edges of Queens, hoping to find a safer path towards Long Island. The theory was that, away from the higher population density, maybe I'd be less likely to bump into violent survivor factions. I followed the Beltway's remnants, weaving past wrecks of trucks and cars that were left behind in the panic. The Hollow often flitted in and out of my orbit, some drawn to me more strongly than others. In Howard Beach, I paused near the remains of a half-collapsed office building to check for supplies or working power. The building had once housed a real estate company, cheap desks, water-stained carpets, motivational posters still tacked to the walls. A few flickering lights revealed a battered generator in the basement, but it was out of fuel, its reserves spent. No one else was there, but I found evidence that a small group had holed up inside, possibly for weeks. Canned food wrappers littered a corner, and a few personal belongings remained: a baby's pacifier, a shoe, a stuffed toy missing an ear. Their owners were gone, leaving behind only the faint impression of normal lives. The following day, I approached a wide intersection near JFK Airport. Planes lay scattered on runways. Some crashed into hangars, their tails snapped. Whatever official evacuation plan the city once had was clearly abandoned. The runways looked peppered with makeshift barricades and abandoned ground vehicles. I considered searching for a working radio tower or anything that might broadcast signals, but I thought better of it. If security was posted anywhere, it would be at a strategic location like an airport, and I didn't want to be mistaken for an approaching threat, especially with a crowd of Hollow in tow. I continued east, never staying in one spot for too long. Each day blended into the next, rummaging empty shops, dodging suspicious survivor enclaves, and forging deeper into suburban sprawl. At times, I wondered if I should aim for a known safe zone, but the last reliable rumors I had were old. I'd seen no new updates. My phone was long dead, and any charger I found was useless with no electricity grid. Once I stumbled upon a walled community that looked freshly fortified. Wooden stakes and metal panels formed a rough barrier around a block of tall houses, the windows boarded. My curiosity was piqued, but as I advanced, a shrill whistle sounded from somewhere inside. Moments later, a volley of projectiles soared over the barricade, arrows or crossbow bolts, I couldn't tell. I ducked into a side alley, hearing them thud into the pavement. The Hollow behind me groaned softly, uncertain whether to retaliate or drift away. It reminded me again that any direct encounter with living survivors posed a serious hazard to my life. Through all of this, I reflected on how drastically my mindset had changed. Not long ago, I would have tried to negotiate. to explain my condition, maybe even to help bolster their defenses. But the memory of that family still replayed in my head. I recalled the father's desperate blow, the mother's blade, the chaos that followed. Why endanger myself again? I shook off any lingering guilt and continued down the cracked sidewalk. In these endless days, I also glimpsed the darker side of my advantage. More than once, I heard voices calling out for help in the distance, sometimes from rooftops, sometimes from behind chain-link fences. The hollow behind me shifted with mild interest whenever they sensed these pleas. The easier path was to pass by. What else could I do? If I approached, the frightened survivors might interpret me as a threat. They might even open fire, and if they shot first, the hollow would respond. It was more risk than I was willing to take. I maintained my strange equilibrium, living on the fringe, drifting among the hollow, scavenging enough supplies to stay alive. My epilepsy medication supply was still decent, but the partial infection in my system left me unsure of my own body's future. I hoped that at least the medication would keep the seizure auras in check, preventing me from summoning a massive throng if I lost control. That was my one real fear. If my brain activity spiked unpredictably, it might trigger every hollow in a wide radius to converge on me, or anyone near me. Still, the days trudged onward. I developed a keen eye for safe places to rest, rooftops or fenced yards that could be locked behind me. My interactions with the hollow were minimal. They lingered, but they didn't exactly crowd me unless I became anxious or unsettled. The tension in the air somehow communicated to them, as if they were more attuned to my mental state than any external cues. I found one short reprieve in a small suburban library near the Ozone Park area. A shattered window offered entry, and the interior was largely intact. Shelves stood in neat rows, full of unread books gathering dust. I paced along the aisles, noting titles about local history, biology, and children's stories. I imagined it once filled with eager readers, maybe kids doing homework or seniors reading newspapers. Now it was a silent monument to what we lost. A faint beam of sunlight through broken skylights cast shadows on the floor. I thought about waiting out the night there, but the building's wide glass entrance felt too exposed. So I grabbed a few random paperbacks that I could burn for warmth if needed, and I moved on. Weeks of this wandering stretched me to my limit, but I held to the new principle I'd set for myself after the subway station debacle. No more rushing to people's aid. No more illusions of saving those who refused to be saved. It felt heartless at times, but how else would I survive? I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix a broken world that had turned me into a pariah. Eventually, I left the outskirts of the city altogether. I followed the major highways that led into Long Island, passing signs welcoming travelers to Nassau County. Little by little, the cityscape gave way to leafy neighborhoods and stretches of green. The suburbs were not spared, though. I saw entire rows of split-level homes abandoned, front yards overrun with tall grass. Some hollow ambled across cul-de-sacs, bumping into mailboxes and stepping through flower beds turned to weeds. I discovered small pockets of farmland, fields once used for local produce. Now they lay unharvested, with rows of wilted crops. Occasionally, I'd see evidence of farmland that had been used as a campsite. Blackened fire pits, scattered tins, signs that people had attempted to forge a new start away from the city's chaos. But once again, no inhabitants remained. By this point, the group of hollow trailing me had become something like a traveling shadow. They were never truly gone, only receding to some distance if I rested in a fortified space. If I tried to walk quickly, their numbers would stretch out, scattered behind me. When I paused or lingered somewhere, they gradually closed in again. It was eerily comforting in a strange, twisted sense. They never threatened me, never demanded anything. They simply existed in my periphery, silent watchers in a lonely world. Looking back, that feeling, knowing I was never fully alone, blurred the line of my humanity further. Sometimes I thought, are these my companions now? Then I'd shove the notion aside. reminding myself they were mindless, infected shells. If I ever forgot that, I only needed to recall the carnage they unleashed whenever fear or aggression ignited them. Still, a small part of me felt less isolated than the survivors cowering behind walls, consumed by paranoia. Now, I've journeyed beyond the edges of New York into the Long Island region. I haven't found a cure or an intact safe zone, nor am I convinced either exists anymore. If there's a working government or rescue operation, they haven't made themselves known. The highways and local roads here stretch on, lined with shuttered strip malls, empty gas stations, and an occasional sign proclaiming, "God help us." I continue moving east, stopping only when I sense that a location is secure enough for a night's rest. I keep an eye out for any small medical clinics that might stock the anti-seizure medication I rely on. My supply remains stable for now, though I'm constantly aware it won't last forever. And if I ever run out, I'm not sure what that means for my partial infection or my uncanny bond with the hollow. Sometimes, in the dim recesses of an abandoned house or a quiet basement, I revisit the thought that maybe I should broadcast my existence. If I could rig up a ham radio or shortwave transmitter, perhaps I could let others know there's a person who moves freely among the infected. Maybe, if the right people heard it, they'd see me as an asset instead of a monster. But then I remember the battered father swinging at me, the mother's knife, and that boy's terrified eyes. I remember stumbling backward, trying to help, only to be struck with the knowledge that no one wanted what I offered. The leftover guilt nags at me in unexpected moments. I might be rummaging through a closet for blankets, or stepping over a downed streetlight, and an image of that family invades my mind. I see the father pinned by hollow, the mother desperately swiping her knife. I see the child's small figure overshadowed by horror. A trace of regret stirs in me, but I brush it aside. Each time I remind myself of the new rule: no more illusions of heroism. I've seen other acts of distrust too. Farther along the highway, I stumbled upon a scene where a group of heavily armed survivors had captured a woman they accused of being infected. She appeared terrified, cornered against a broken fence, insisting she was fine. I hung back, hidden by an overturned RV, not wanting to get involved. They forced her to roll up her sleeves, searching for marks or bites. She had none, but paranoia fueled them. One wanted to lock her up until they were certain. Another demanded they send her away. For a brief second, I considered intervening. Maybe I could command a few hollow to scare the group and let her slip free. But I remained still, recalling the subway station's fiasco. If I charged in, these people might react with open hostility, turning their weapons on me. So I ducked away, letting the drama play out without me. Perhaps that choice was morally questionable. Perhaps the woman needed a rescuer. But I wasn't that kind of person anymore, not after all I'd seen and lived through. At night, I sometimes stand in a deserted street or on a crumbling balcony, looking up at the sky. The lights of the city are gone, replaced by dark silhouettes of silent buildings. Stars are brighter than I remember them being before all this happened. In those moments, I wrestle with the idea that maybe I'm losing my humanity by refusing to help. I used to care so deeply about doing the right thing, but the cost of trying to help in a world that punishes kindness is something I'm no longer willing to pay. Occasionally, I'll cross paths with a small band of travelers, a few half-starved adults, maybe a teenager carrying supplies. They freeze when they see my ragged appearance and the presence of any hollow in the background. I used to wave or call out. Now, I quietly divert my path, giving them a wide berth. There's no point in forging alliances that will crumble the moment they realize I'm half-infected, or that I can attract the hollow like some sort of beacon. It isn't a pleasant way to live, but it keeps me breathing. My immunity, combined with the partial infection, means I can slip through the worst areas relatively unscathed. And if that means I'm forced to remain an outcast, so be it. A few personal possessions still rattle around in my backpack. A Polaroid photo of my parents from years ago. A battered notepad with a few scribbled phone numbers I'll never call. and the ID badge from my old lab job in Midtown. Sometimes I stare at that badge, recalling how the biggest crisis in my life used to be picking up my medication on time or finishing a stressful day at work. Now, medication is my lifeline, and a stressful day involves deciding whether to leave survivors to their fate or risk my own safety for them. I don't expect a magical reset button or some promise that the old world will be restored. There's talk of military bases or distant islands where the infection hasn't spread, but I've yet to see any evidence. The Hollow remain a fixture everywhere I go, lurking in side streets, drifting through fields, or following along behind me like quiet shadows. If I stop and listen, sometimes I can almost sense their presence through the partial infection in my body. It's as though my mind opens a channel to their vacant consciousness. When I dwell on that too long, it sends my thoughts spiraling. So I keep moving. From time to time, I come across old documents or abandoned laptops where people tried to research the cause of the outbreak. Some mention mutated viruses or prion diseases. Others reference secret government labs or chemical spills. None give me a definitive answer. Perhaps that's fitting for a catastrophe of this magnitude. Nobody fully understands it, and it doesn't matter now anyway. The damage is done. If this account ever reaches someone in a sheltered community or a hidden compound with functioning power, I can already imagine the questions. Why not unify survivors? Why not rally the Hollow for a noble cause? Couldn't you lead them away from population centers or buy time for a vaccine to be distributed? My response is simple. I don't trust people enough to risk it, and I don't trust the Hollow enough to believe they can be commanded. They follow me, yes, but they're still driven by impulses I can't fully control. Every time fear or violence flares, they react in the only way they know how. Once I considered traveling north, hoping to escape the worst of the city sprawl, but I suspect it's the same everywhere. I might reach the mountains, only to find the same paranoia, the same attacks, the same misguided survivors. So for now, I roam the suburbs and open spaces of Long Island, forging onward until I can't anymore. My existence isn't glamorous or heroic, and I've come to terms with that. I'm no longer the reluctant leader. I no longer aspire to save the ungrateful. Whatever altruism I once had died in that subway station in Brooklyn. Now I live day by day, scavenging for supplies, mindful of my diminishing medication. I watch the Hollow for signs that they sense something dangerous ahead, like living enclaves or armed patrols, and I circumvent trouble whenever I can. If you're hearing or reading this, maybe you'll judge me for giving up on humanity. Or maybe you'll understand that sometimes survival means letting go of the old moral codes. I've seen too much betrayal to continue risking my life for strangers who'd sooner destroy me than shake my hand. Let them label me cold, detached, or cruel. At least I'm alive to tell the tale. And that's the final truth I've reached. This world rewards caution, not blind hope. A piece of me regrets it, especially whenever I recall that frightened boy clutching my arm. But regret won't bring back the person I used to be, nor will it fix the broken hearts that lash out in panic. All I can do is persist. Martin Hale, the half-immune, half-infected wanderer, signing off with one last note of wisdom. Beware of kindness in a world where survival instincts trump empathy. I learned that lesson the hard way. Some might still believe in saving everyone. That's their choice. But I won't stand in their way, or risk my own life to share their dream. Not anymore. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.